5210. Every kid, every day. Let's have fun the healthy way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 servings of fruit and veggies are great to eat. 1, 2 hours of playtime or less on our screens is more than plenty. And let's go play outside. 1 hour! Tiger it, my turn to hide. 0 sugary drinks. Yeah, that's the healthy way to think. Every kid, every day. Let's have fun the healthy way. Every kid, every day. Let's have fun the healthy way. 5210.
All right, welcome everybody. So on that note, I guess I'll start introductions. Hey everybody, I'm Jessie Kreiner from Keys for Healthy Kids, and I'd like to welcome you all to episode 6 of Project Echo for Pediatric Obesity. Today's episode is entitled Improving Kids' Health and Community Food Security in West Virginia by Fostering Nourishing Networks. You can definitely tell that that title was written by somebody who's used to research papers. And so at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mirinda. Mirinda, take it away.
Hello, everyone. We're happy you're here today. I'm the clinical coordinator for Keys for Healthy Kids, and I'm really pleased today I have Josh Lohnes with me. And he is a human geographer who serves as a research assistant professor at WVU, advancing questions related to agri-food systems governance with an emphasis on the political economy of nutrition assistance programs. Can you tell he has his PhD? Josh directs the work of the Food Justice Lab at the Center for Resilient Communities. He is actively engaged with local, national, and international coalitions that seek to advance the right to food through principles of food sovereignty and food justice. So really happy that Josh is here today with us. Our objectives today are going to be by the end of this session, participants will be able to understand intersectional barriers to food access for an individual and a community, and to think about various food access strategies used by households and their implications on healthy food availability. So before we turn it over to Josh to discuss about food access, I wanted to talk about the intersection between food insecurity and childhood obesity. And, you know, there's been a lot of research recently done about that connection and how important it is that our kids have access to nutritious foods. So there was an article that the name of the article is Food Insecurity and Childhood Obesity, Is There a Connection? And it's from the American Society of Nutrition. It was written September 10th, 2019 by Kathy Bierman, who also has her PhD. And the article referenced a study that was published in September 2019 in the Journal of Nutrition. And it looked at the relationship between household food insecurity and child adiposity related outcomes. This study included variables such as body mass index, waist circumference, and diet outcomes. It was collected in 2013 to 2015 from 5,138 US school children ages 4 to 15 years old from 130 communities. And from this research, they found that children from food insecure households had high body mass index, waist circumference, greater odds of being classified as overweight or obese, consumed more sugar from sugar-sweetened beverages, and less frequently ate breakfast and dinner with family compared to children from food-secure households. So there's definitely a connection between those things. So we're gonna start off with talking with Josh about thinking about why food access is important. So Josh, can you talk a little bit about that, why we have to discuss food access?
Yes, thank you, Mirinda, and the whole team at Keys for Healthy Kids for inviting me today. I think the concept of access is important to think about because it's really a web of social relationships that's woven over time, particularly when it comes to food. We have a bunch of systems, processes, programs in place that create this web of access for families to negotiate every day And we tend to think about food access in a, binary, like, is there food available perhaps in proximity to someone's home? But there are a whole bunch of factors that may limit a household's ability to access food that have nothing to do with location. There may be programs, nutrition assistance programs that exist that are not accessible for various reasons, either due to paperwork or how far away the DHHR office is to access those programs, or even what stores make those programs available. So today I'm hoping we can have a conversation about these intersectional barriers to food access, and then some of the existing opportunities that are there to improve access to healthy food.
Very good. Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, I think one thing that I really drew from what you just said was that it's not one thing. So it's multiple things that affect food access, and whether or not a child or an adult has the ability to eat nutritious food. So I think you wanted to talk about nourishing networks, right? That's something that we definitely wanted to talk about today. And I'm not really that familiar with it. And I think a lot of people probably on this call are not as well. So can you go into that conversation about what nourishing networks is?
Yes. So Nourishing Networks is a program that launched in 2016 as a popular education curriculum for communities to come together around the table and discuss what the specific barriers to food access were in their communities. This came out of a project called West Virginia Food Link, where the Food Justice Lab, in partnership with, at the time, the Appalachian Food Shed Project, mapped out, all of the available food resources we could think about in the state, from food charities, where are they, when are they open, what paperwork do you need to access that food charity, to grocery stores, what types of grocery stores exist, their geographic distribution, what kinds of foods they carry, trying to understand public assistance programs in schools, and accessibility to SNAP, to WIC, to various school meal programs like, free and reduced lunch, which is year round, but also summer feeding programs. What are the gaps when school is out of session? So we compiled this database and visualized it on the FoodLink website, but then we didn't just want that data to sit. It's useful for grant writing, it's useful for trying to understand what the problem is, but we also wanted communities to engage with the data, to kind of even break the data and say, hey, this program is not made visible on your website, but we actually have this whole network of people doing really innovative stuff here. So we developed the Nourishing Networks curriculum, which was a way to pair the data collected through FoodLink, which a lot of it was, federal Census Bureau data, and then local data we collected with food banks and research we did at the lab, with local knowledge.
And what was, just real quick, what kind of data were you collecting?
All of those I just mentioned, data on the geographic distribution of food retailers, of food charities, school meal programs and their enrollment.
Okay.
Those types of data. And you can find that still available on the FoodLink website, which is foodlink.wvu.edu. And so in 2016, we had the launch of that website and kind of a statewide workshop, a 2-day workshop, trying to develop this curriculum. And then we piloted it in 6 different counties across the state. And the cool thing was that really a whole bunch of different types of food system practitioners gathered around a table from different sectors. So we had, folks from the DHHR office, or farmers, food pantry directors, foundations, all at the table trying to wrestle with, what is the problem here? What is the food access barrier that we face? But then what are the assets that exist in our community to actually address this issue? So we did that in 6 counties, and we're now in a phase of trying to empower folks to run their own Nourishing Networks workshops. This doesn't have to be at the county scale. It could be at a municipal level. It could even be in a public housing complex or with a daycare center. It's just a matter of bringing people together and running through the curriculum.
Great. So what came from that? Can you go over some specifics about the Nourishing Networks curriculum?
Mm-hmm.
What are the kinds of things that you do with that curriculum and look at?
Yeah, so the first thing that we look at, the first phase of the workshop, is identifying food access barriers. And again, these are intersectional, and the wheel on the left here is just the tool that we use to conceptualize how people negotiate all the intersecting barriers to food access. So people are at the center of decision-making processes, but it's important to remember that food is also one of the most flexible, elastic budget items in a household. So you have rent or a mortgage payment that's fixed. You have electric bills and trash bills and cell phone bills. These things don't really fluctuate, they're fixed. And food is often the one that is, takes the first hit, basically. If your car breaks down and you need to make a repair to continue going to work, then often food bears the brunt on the budget side. So we look at food access through this lens and go through each spoke of the wheel. Crisis, how do different families respond to crisis? That can be, natural disaster like a flood. It could also be losing a job or having a sickness, a death in the family that can affect food access. And we talk about, the history of various crises in those places and how they may be continuing to affect food access in the present. Income is a huge one, identifying how people are accessing income, whether that be wages or the adequacy of wages, lost wages, but also federal assistance programs. These things are constantly shifting. We can think, for example, of the child tax credit that was passed as part of the CARES Act, I believe. So for 6 months, families with children were receiving $300 a month per child, which was a huge income boost to low-income families. And then suddenly in December, those payments stopped. So thinking about income as a key barrier to food access. Identity, this is also a very broad category. Questions of gender equality and food access. Single mother-headed households are some of the most food insecure group across the board. Black female-headed households are the most food insecure group. So, race, gender, age, all these things are identities that tend to affect how people navigate food environments. Knowledge, we talk about, do people know? There's many things to know. I mean, a lot of you on this call are nutritionists. How do we access a decent meal out of what we have in the cupboard is a knowledge base, but also how do we navigate federal nutrition assistance programs? Where do I go? How do I fill out the application? All of these things can be barriers to a family to accessing healthy food. And then finally, the location is a pretty obvious one. If you don't live close to a place that offers nutritious foods, then it's going to be harder to access that, especially if you're a low-income family. So, we break out all of the spokes of this wheel over 2-3 hours and really have the community make a list of all of the barriers they can think of. And then the second part of the workshop is looking at assets. It's like, well, it's not just barriers. There are things, opportunities that we have in these communities to enhance food access, and what are those? And so we go to the strategies wheel, looking at state nutrition assistance programs, which a lot of folks are surprised at the level of investment in nutrition assistance from the state. It's upwards of $750 million that was dispersed last year. And, we tend to focus a lot on charitable food networks as a response to hunger, but that's only a fraction of what actually goes on in terms of addressing food access failure. Markets, what does your food environment look like in your community? Here in Morgantown, we have a breadth of choice when it comes to grocery stores and markets and specialty markets, but a lot of places around the state, you're lucky if you have a corner store that has produce on the shelf. So these kinds of dynamics definitely influence food access, and we have to think about some of the dynamics of, power behind where markets are located, why they're located there, the corporate capture of our food system. So these are all issues that we wrestle with and then try to figure out, can we together as a community come up with alternative market strategies? Self-provisioning is a huge one, hunting, gardening, fishing, that we also like to elevate as an asset because it's often not discussed in food access conversations. But, we've in this state harvest about as much venison each year as food is distributed by the Mountaineer Food Bank. So, accessing food off the land is still a strategy that we can invest in, that can be elevated. So yeah, that's kind of the curriculum, is just going through each of these spokes, talking through them, and coming up then with plans to improve food access at the local level.
Those are great. That's all. That pretty much covers all the food access barriers. I mean, and it's interesting. I like it that it's all, that you have those divided, because it really does make you consider each spoke of that wheel. And we don't always consider that, the identity, we don't always consider that as an issue for food access. So I think it's really important that you've addressed all of those barriers. So from your Nourishing Network workshops, are there any reports that you guys have issued from those workshops?
Yes, so the 6 pilot workshops, and I call them pilot workshops because they were the ones facilitated by the Food Justice Lab, along with, in partnership with SNAP Ed educators. We did them in Wayne, Logan, Fayette, Wood, Wetzel, and I'm forgetting one of them, but they're all on the FoodLink website as 25-30 page reports that just outline all of the barriers that were identified, all of the strategies that were identified, all of the people that participated in that meeting, and then some of the forward-looking strategies that community wants to try to put into place. Some of those require investments, either from philanthropic dollars through grants, or investments from the county, or investments from the state. But I encourage those on the call to download a report from a region that is close to you and take a look at it, because they're quite informative. And what we hope is that as more and more folks become aware of this curriculum and are trained as Nourishing Networks facilitators, that we'll begin to have more of these conversations, and especially link these conversations together into broader food policy change. So we have the West Virginia Food for All Coalition that works with our state and federal elected officials to try and advance food policies that make sense to improve healthy food access here in West Virginia. And only by, the more grassroots knowledge we can bring to bear on that process, the more powerful that coalition is going to be. So ideally, we'd be running these nourishing networks all over the state in different communities.
Wonderful. So what were some of the main barriers to food access that were identified from those workshops?
Yeah, if you can put that slide up. So we kind of consolidated from those 6 workshops the top 10 barriers that were identified overall. And income was the number 1 barrier. So this is, in the 20th and 21st century, the way that we have decided as a society to access food is to exchange money for food. I mean, food has been turned into a commodity that is bought and sold mostly. Now there's all of these programs that try to counter that. You go to a food charity and there's no exchange of money. You can go to a school meal program and there's no exchange of money, that the state is paying for that. But we still have a commodified food system that's heavily dependent on people having the ability to exchange their wages or other resources for food. In that, along with a lack of transportation, were clearly the top 2 access barriers in our state. And then the other, 3 through 10, you can see decline or absence of jobs is huge. Closure of industry and people being laid off, and unemployment benefits only lasting 8 months. Grocery store availability. I'm not going to go down the entire list, but these were the top 10 identified throughout the workshop process. And so when it then comes to addressing these through the policy sphere, if we were able to crack this nut of transportation and income, we would ostensibly see a significant decline in food access failure.
Yeah, for those of you that can't see the slide, I'm just going to read. So 5 was lack of communication for resources, 6, social stigmas and discrimination within the food system, 7, government regulations, 8, drug addiction, 9, education and knowledge, and 10, community health and lack of interest, buy-in to programs. So yeah, but the top 2 were lack of transportation and low income. So which we know, if you can't get to the food, you're not going to be able to access healthy food. And I know for sure there have been in rural areas a lot of grocery stores that have closed, and that has created a lot of issues with people not having access. And so, that again is where that tie-in is to childhood obesity, because if they don't have access to the healthy foods, then they eat whatever they can get, which is usually the less nutritious option. Mm-hmm. And that's where it creates a problem with healthy foods.
Yeah, and one example of this, the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children, Supplemental Women, Infants, and Children program that provides nutrition assistance dollars to pregnant mothers and children under 5. It's a wonderful program. It's very prescriptive. You have money to buy specific food types. But in the state of West Virginia, we're seeing a massive decline in enrollment in that program. And the reason being is that the regulations around WIC make it very difficult for a food retailer to carry the array of products that are eligible for WIC. So what ends up happening is we only have, Kroger, Walmart, Food Lion, and a few other grocery store chains that are actually places where WIC can be redeemed. And we're also seeing a desertification of those stores in a lot of communities. So if you live in Clay County, you can go get WIC vouchers, but you're going to have to drive to Charleston to redeem them. So we also need to be thinking about, policy change at these different scales of government that can perhaps relax rules on the WIC eligibility for stores. So it's just one example of, this intersection between transportation and income. Even if there is additional income from the state through WIC, if you can't get to a WIC approved store, then it's going to limit your ability to access those foods.
So I did not know that. That's a really good point, Josh. Maybe I did see a couple of questions in the chat. So maybe Jesse, we'll go ahead and go to the questions right now, and then we take a break at the half hour. So let's do, I did see one question. Do you want to go ahead and read that question?
Sure. We had a question from Jessica. Her question was, produce access is seen in many dollar stores now. Is that being utilized by communities?
The dollar stores in West Virginia, so Dollar General does have a program called DG Fresh that is being piloted in some of their stores around the country, but it hasn't yet arrived in West Virginia. My understanding is that by I think 2026 is their goal to have every single Dollar General have a produce stand. The issue that I see with Dollar Generals is that they're not actually contributing to community well-being, in that a lot of those dollars aren't recirculating in our community. A lot of that produce that's on the shelf is imported from Mexico and California, and has a whole bunch of problematic wage relationships associated with it. So what I would love to see is, we're working on this in the Food for All Coalition with the SNAP-Ed working group. How do we get more regional produce into our corner stores, our dollar stores, that are actually producing economic value for our communities? So Dollar General is very extractive. I mean, that it's owned, I think the 30% shareholder is Citigroup, the big bank. They don't necessarily have an interest in the well-being of West Virginia communities. They're just trying to turn a profit. And I think we need to be thinking about systems that both increase food access while also promoting economic development and job and income opportunities. So this is obviously a huge nut to crack, but we need to be talking about it, because just increasing the availability of produce isn't necessarily solving the income problem, right? And we're seeing food inflation right now, soaring. So even if there is produce available, do folks have the means to purchase it?
Yeah, and gas prices soaring too.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that all the time. Like,
if you have to drive a long ways to find a store that'll accept your WIC, but you know how much gas is at the moment, are you really gonna make the drive?
Right.
We had another question in the chat, Miranda, and then I think we'll need to go on to part 2. But what about running a bus to the farmers markets? I think most of them take WIC for produce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a wonderful, innovative idea, and there are some mobile farmers markets across the state. The Food and Farm Coalition runs a few. I know the Williamson Health Center in Mingo County has a mobile produce program. The way that WIC is set up is, again, difficult to do a mobile, just because of the regulations from the USDA. But my understanding is that that is in the works of trying to relax those regulations. Currently, a WIC store has to carry baby formula, for example. Baby formula is expensive to stock and to hold. It expires. So a lot of small businesses, a mobile food truck is not going to want to take the risk to carry baby product. But we have WIC farmers market vouchers that are starting back up here soon. And yeah, there is a coalition of folks in the state actively thinking through this transportation barrier. Let's bring a bus or bring the food to people rather than having them drive. My dream would be to use the CSX rail network and have like a food, because all of these small towns have a rail network, and like, what would it mean if every Thursday there was a 2-train car that pops up and it's like a festival of food, and people know to be there for those 4 hours, and then the train moves on to the next place. So these are like,
love that idea.
Fun utopian imaginaries that I think we need to, also as part of the Nourishing Networks process, we invite people to think, what if resources weren't an issue? What would you like to imagine? And that idea of the CSX car actually came out of Wayne County.
Perfect.
All right. For everyone who is joining us live, don't go anywhere. Session 2 or B will begin immediately. If you're joining us via podcast, Session B of episode 5 is available wherever you listen, whenever you're ready to listen. I said 5, I meant 6. Episode 6, guys. Welcome to Session B of episode 6 of Project Echo for Pediatric Obesity. This is with your feedback. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Miranda and Josh.
Thank you, Jessie. So I'm the clinical coordinator of Keys for Healthy Kids, and this is Josh. He is the human geographer who serves as a research assistant professor at WVU, and we're talking about food access and the Nourishing Networks curriculum and the workshops that they've had. So we were discussing that in the first half about barriers to food access, and we talked about transportation and income being huge barriers to people having access to food. So I thought maybe in the second half, Josh, we could talk about how we can address these barriers. What are some ideas of what we're going to do about these barriers?
Yeah, well, what's wonderful about the Nourishing Networks workshop and actually bringing in a diversity of practitioners around a table to talk about food access is that it really is very generative of new ideas. And if you look at those reports, some of the ideas that came out, some of which are implementable right away with a $5,000 grant, others are like pie in the sky dreams. I think it's important to reiterate that we need a diversity of perspectives when it comes to addressing food access barriers, because some tend to have a myopic focus on food charity as the solution, or we're just going to start a community garden and that's going to resolve all of these access problems. And so by bringing these diversity of perspectives in, widening the table of who is involved in the conversation, and especially including at the table people with lived experience of food insecurity, really generates innovative solutions. Another thing that we need to be considering when we're looking at addressing food access barriers is getting away from hyper-localized responses. So our food system is governed by, the Farm Bill mostly, which is $1 billion piece of legislation that gets passed every 4 years. And then those directives and funding gets passed down to states. The states have some leeway on how they want to implement it, but mostly those rules are written in Washington, D.C. And so I think as communities, we also need to be organizing ourselves to make our voices heard from, our rural, post-industrial West Virginia perspective about what kinds of programs we want to see. And that can start, at the local level, getting engaged in local food policy councils that petition county commissions to pull down different types of money for food access issues, or that petition our delegates and senators at the state to fund programs like this Office of Community Food Security proposal that we put in last year. These kinds of initiatives, I think, will more comprehensively address the major problem, which is laws that are written to reinforce the power of large agro-industrial food concerns at the expense of, smaller community food security initiatives. And if you look at the investments that are being made in our food system right now, they're still heavily geared toward large commodity crop subsidies, corn, soy, wheat, and corn is then converted into corn syrup, which then goes into sweetened beverages. So if our laws are written
liver
to
disease.
yeah, if our laws are written to encourage the production of soda, then we're just going to be throwing little pebbles against a massive mountain. And so I think we also need to organize ourselves to get out the sledgehammer and attack that mountain of food policy. And that again is like a really long haul organizing work. But I think getting the voices of pediatricians, healthcare professionals in the room around the policy table to advance some of the work that the West Virginia Food for All Coalition is doing would really be helpful to addressing food access barriers in our state. And I will also put in a plug for the American Reinvestment Act, or no, the Rescue, ARPA, I can't remember what the acronym is, but the latest stimulus package released by the Biden administration actually provided a significant amount of funds to local jurisdictions, so municipalities and counties. And one of the line items that those monies can be spent on are food access initiatives. And so there are, 220 jurisdictions in West Virginia that are currently sitting on money to be spent. And that's a place where communities can already start getting engaged in food policy work at a more hyper-local level. The most recent county profiles that we published on the FoodLink website kind of give an overview of different ARPA investments that could be made, and have some metrics around food insecurity at the municipal and county level.
It's good to know. So
And
I'm
again,
curious.
I just want to say one more thing around, like, it's great to start a program like a pharmacy program and get funding for it, a pop-up kids market, right? But how are those programs going to be sustained in the long term? I think we really need to be working to shift state policy and tax policy to invest in these kinds of programs.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, we're trying to get the insurance companies to incentivize the healthy, using fruit and vegetable prescription cards to buy produce so that it becomes a benefit that patients can use for their insurance, which makes it more sustainable. So I'm curious, from the workshops that were done, so have any actionable items came out of that workshop that those communities have worked on to make a difference in food access currently, or was it a conversation that we haven't started yet?
Yeah, no, I mean, there has been very interesting things coming out of these workshops. In Wetzel County, a pharmacy program emerged there back in 2017 or 18. In Calhoun County, that was the sixth one, Calhoun. The FRN there has gotten really engaged in food system work coming out of the Nourishing Networks workshop, and Tina Persinger actually wants to run another iteration of it. In Fayette County, we saw, I was just down at the West Virginia Agrarian Commons board meeting, and in the reflection process of now we're in 22, but what brought us up to this? Somebody put up on the board the 2017 Nourishing Networks workshop as kind of the instigator of this conversation around bringing agricultural land back into a commons to help farmers, not be sunk into debt and actually be able to produce produce for these food access programs. So, it's hard to measure exactly what the impact of Nourishing Networks has been. but I think discursive change, like changing the conversation in society, always is a long-term process. And we're hopeful that the more and more people that know about this program and that engage with it and its curriculum, the more we'll be able to have a common sense of purpose in what we're doing. So yeah, I will say, if you want to engage more with Nourishing Networks on your own, each of the spokes of those wheel has an associated video with it. It's like 2 or 3 minutes long. And at the end of that video are a series of questions that you can answer about your community. And if you do that, you know, with 3 or 4 people, just sit down, watch those videos. It can be a kernel or a seed of something that emerges that you hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it has to start with the conversation. So I think when we start with the conversation, then that's when we bring about change, because we first have to recognize that there's an issue, and then we can work on solving it. So how can healthcare providers get involved in the Nourishing Network process? And community members, I should say, because we have everybody on this call. We have healthcare providers and community people as well, and public health. It's just, it's kind of everybody.
Yeah. Well, if you're interested in organizing a Nourishing Networks workshop in your community, we have some facilitators that have been trained out of the Food Justice Lab. We have a USDA Higher Education Challenge grant that's currently developing a certificate on community food systems. So 9 students just came out of that and are prepared to help facilitate a Nourishing Networks workshop. So, you know, if you were interested in running this in a community that you're interacting with, definitely reach out and we can try to make that happen. And this certificate program is actually next year going to be open to the general public, to not just WVU students, but also, you know, folks looking to get continuing education credit or just a certificate in food system development. So if you were interested in that, you can also stay tuned and perhaps next summer take a short course to become a Nourishing Networks facilitator.
Wonderful.
And then I would say the other way is engaging with the work of the West Virginia Food for All Coalition. We usually every fall try to put out a policy platform, and the coalition is made up of, again, a broad group, different types of organizations, from the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition, you know, SNAP Ed, the 2 food banks in our state, the Center for Budget and Policy, I think the American Heart Association, and, you know, engaging with the Food for All Summit that happens each year and the policy platform, and just lending your voice to that effort by making calls to your delegates, getting involved in crafting various policies is always helpful.
You have anything else you want to discuss, Josh?
No, I mean, I would love to get more
anybody
feedback from folks and answer any questions that people on the call might have.
And so if anybody has any questions, you can either unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat box. So are there plans to do any more workshops?
Again, what we're hoping is that so we are going to do another one in Calhoun County, but we no longer want to be the main drivers of, like, we're going to go to this place, and we want it to come from people in place that are wanting to run these workshops. And, you know, in late 2019, we held a Train the Trainers conference with a bunch of SNAP educators and a few other folks that were trained over 2 days on how to run this. We were going to run a couple in 2020, and then COVID hit, and all of the plans around in-person workshops obviously morphed. So
Yes.
I'm trying to do some online hybrid events around this, but we're hoping now with people meeting more in person that this will happen. I mean, interestingly, the Mountaineer Food Bank has picked up this curriculum and is running workshops in certain places. New Roots Community Farm in Fayette County is planning on running a workshop. And what we see our role as is continuing to accompany people that want to engage with this curriculum, and building all of those people into a shared network of knowledge and really activism around food system issues.
I think Mayor Cavalier has a question.
First of all, thank you very, very much. This is really good information and appreciated. We have a kind of situation, but that may exist in a lot of places. Kroger's left us, but we were able to attract Grant's Supermarket.
Mm-hmm.
And the CEO of Grant's is Ronnie Martin, who also is the mayor of Bluefield.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ronnie and I have a couple of different avenues of communication, really good rapport. But one of the things that keeps cropping up in our conversations, and it's totally unresolved, is his first goal is to make money for his company,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so he has to put in his store what will sell.
Yep.
And the things that sell are not the healthiest things. They are the cheapest things with the highest calorie count. Have you seen any sort of practices or policies that help both the consumer use their funds for healthier food while not causing a financial problem for the grocery store owner, so that you can get the grocery store owner to participate and stock the better food? Is that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like chicken and the egg.
The program that first comes to mind is the SNAP Stretch program, which is currently administered by the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition. So that one incentivizes families that have SNAP dollars, that's food stamps, to purchase fruits and vegetables that currently it's West Virginia grown fruits and vegetables. So it's limited to, farmers markets or produce stands or farm stands. But, we could most likely do this in Bluefield with the Grant Supermarket if they wanted to come on board. And
Smithers.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it's basically a program that doubles your SNAP dollars if you're purchasing vegetables. So if I'm buying, $10 worth of vegetables, I'm actually getting $20.
Mm-hmm.
Or if I'm spending $10 on my SNAP, I'm getting. And I think that those kinds of incentives are really where we need to be looking at, because as a, economic individual, you're going to make decisions based on the resources that you have available. And of course, if, there's a lot of power in these food companies, even in terms of marketing, right? I mean, you look at Super Bowl ads and all of these things that create desire for certain types of food products. How are we creating programs that counter that desire through economic rationalities? The problem with the SNAP Stretch program right now is that it's funded ad hoc through a USDA grant and also subsidized by the SNAP Ed program. And what we're trying to do is to get that coded and funded by the state legislature long term, right? And there are certain states like Massachusetts and California that have actually paired it with their swipe system. So there's not even this script exchange. You just go to the store, swipe, and it's like you didn't even spend any money. So a few of us are working on advancing that, and there are conversations with the DHHR to try to create a SNAP Stretch fund and have the program administered within DHHR. And that's been an ongoing conversation for 3 or 4 years, and hopefully we can get there. Another one
So
is
there a possibility, Josh, for expansion of SNAP Stretch to be used at supermarkets instead of just farmers markets? Because that's not going to help her with grants, because it's at the, like, grants doesn't want to provide the produce because people don't buy it. So like that would help at a farmer's market, which I think Smithers already, I think you guys have SNAP Stretch at your farmer's market.
Yes.
But it doesn't
But
help
that's
the
only once,
supermarket.
yeah, that our farmer's market's only once a month though.
Right. So it doesn't
Yeah.
help their supermarket unless you make SNAP Stretch accessible to a supermarket.
yeah, I mean, the thing is that you could also just go to Bluefield City Council, who just received ARPA money, and say, we want $500,000 to double purchases of produce within city limits. It doesn't all have to go through the Food and Farm Coalition is what I'm saying. Like, you can create your own kind of SNAP Stretch program. Ideally, these would be eventually consolidated, but there's no reason why a store couldn't, locally create these kinds of incentives if the political will was there at the county level or at the city level. Another one that I will mention on the food policy front, like with sweetened beverages, are soda taxes, which a lot of some states and cities have implemented, which have dissuaded consumers. So it's rather than the incentive, it's like, oh, well, this is more expensive, I'm not going to buy it. The politics of that in West Virginia are pretty interesting. My institution, WVU, is actually wrapped up in the current tax structure that funds some of the hospital, and they don't quite want to change it. And then the American Heart Association only wants to lobby for it if it's at a certain level of taxation. But I think this is another avenue to look at. And like, what if we designed a tax on, junk foods or unhealthy foods that actually then subsidized a SNAP Stretch like program? So we'll tax soda and put all of that money into a double your bucks SNAP. Those are the kinds of ideas I think we need at our state legislature, to change our food environments going forward.
So Dr. Jeffrey had written, what are current actions for more fresh produce at food banks? Do you know?
Well, yeah, food banks are quite flooded with produce right now. It's actually pretty interesting. So Feeding America, which is the large national consortium under which most food banks fall. They have huge produce terminals where they're buying excess that couldn't make it into supermarkets. And the one that we use here in West Virginia is in Philadelphia. So Mountaineer Food Bank and Facing Hunger will send an 18-wheeler out to Philadelphia, load up on produce, and distribute that for free or for very cheap to charities. A lot of the issue right now is around infrastructure and storage. So fresh produce is great, but it also doesn't last as long as Cheerios. So there are massive investments at work in trying to tool up local charities to have storage capacity. What I think is interesting with that is trying to get beyond just merely a charitable food model, and how do we use these sites, which are often some of the primary food access sites in a community in West Virginia, right? There's no grocery store, but there's a food pantry. Okay, and now they're getting funds for a walk-in freezer, and they're getting funds for fridges. Is there a way to create a charity market hybrid where you could actually also go spend your SNAP dollars on produce and get your free USDA chicken. I think we need to be thinking creatively, and get out of the strictly charitable model. Because, I wrote my dissertation on the food charity system, and a lot of it benefits entrenched agro-food interests. So if we're going to rebuild a regional food economy that makes sense, we need to be thinking about what is the role of these local food charities in building that out.
And then we had one other question about if backpack programs were discussed as barriers to healthy foods. And they're talking about, they are loaded with Gatorade, ramen noodles, soda, super donuts.
Yeah, it does. That comes up a lot, actually. But the variability of backpack programs is immense, right? And it's kind of like at the whims of the backpack program director, both in terms of the resources that agency has to fill a backpack. So our backpack programs in Mon County are managed by Scotts Run Settlement House. They're one of the most well-funded charities in the state, food charities. And, so they may have the mean, and then they have access to all of these grocery stores and donations and things. It may be harder for a backpack program in Tucker or Calhoun or Clay County to fill their packs with healthy foods, right? It's and so this backpack program phenomenon is also a lot like pharmacy, uncoordinated. There's no rules or regulations around what has to go into a backpack. It's very ad hoc. So that's, again, if we were able to create something like an Office of Community Food Security that gave directives or suggestions around these things. When you are building a backpack program, consider, these menu items. And by the way, here's also a pot of money from the state to help improve the nutritional content of that backpack program if you're an under-resourced agency. These are the things we need to be talking and thinking about.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. And yes, thank you, Josh, for being here. We really do appreciate it.
You're welcome. And I'll put my email in the chat again if anybody has questions. Feel free to reach out.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you guys so much for joining us today. What happened? Anyway, this concludes episode 6 of Project Echo for Pediatric Obesity. Please fill out the evaluation link in the chat. It helps us out a lot, and we appreciate you for attending with us today. If you give me just a moment, you'd like to hear our lovely outro song, it is
Playtime or less on our screens is more than plenty. Let's go play outside. 1 hour. Tiger it, my turn to hide. 0 sugary drinks. Yeah, that's the healthy way to think. Every kid, every day. Let's have fun the healthy way. Every kid, every day. Let's have fun the healthy way. 5, 2, 1, 0.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.